Here, you need to put these on. The sheriff held out stiff cards with strings attached. What are they? ID tags. Put them on your coats. George looked at the other Japanese passengers in the truck. All wore a white card prominently displayed. Numbers. His family was reduced to numbers. He swallowed his shame and handed out the tags. Pamela took 2 and helped their mother tie one around a button on her black coat. He couldn't look his brothers in the eyes when he gave them their tags. Instead, he busied himself with his own. His fingers were suddenly unable to work, and he fumbled much too long on the simple task. He couldn't help comparing it to the Star of David that the Jews were forced to wear in Nazi Germany.
That was Elaine Cockrell reading from her novel, A Shrug of the Shoulders. Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome back to Book Chat. We've been on a 2-year hiatus because of the coronavirus, and I'm really excited to talk about your book. And it's a powerful book, a powerful story about Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II here in the Pacific Northwest. But there's a number of stories within it. It's a saga of families. The Yano family, who come from Toppenish, Washington, who lost their farm. The Mita family, who lost their business in Portland. They come together in the camps. It's a story of the Herzog family, beet farmers in eastern Oregon, and how all these families interact during those difficult years. But it's also a love story about George Yano falling in love with Molly Mita in the camps. It's a story about war on the home front as it was experienced during those years in eastern Oregon, in the small towns and the beet fields. And it's also a coming-of-age story about 16-year-old Ellis Herzog as he grows up during the war times. How did you come to think of and write this story?
I helped my grandmother write her family memoir, and during that time I found out that during World War II they hired Japanese Americans to work on their beet fields. And I was born in Nyssa, Oregon, where the story takes place, and I didn't know that there had been Japanese Americans living there. Mm-hmm. And I found that I was quite ignorant of all the Japanese friends that I had, all the students there. And so my grandmother's story piqued my interest, and I have thought about it for years and years. So I wanted to tell the story of what it was like in Eastern Oregon when the Japanese came to make their lives there. And like I said, I had Japanese friends in Adrian, and then in Nyssa, and then in college. So, and their stories were quite painful to them, and the parents felt it was very painful as well. So I didn't know how to talk about it.
They didn't really talk about their experiences then?
No, it was, I only knew the Hirai family that lived down the road from my grandparents' house, and they had been able to buy land, and one of the brothers, the older brothers, became a judge in our community, and his youngest son, Brian, went to school with me both in Adrian and in Nyssa. And so that's how I came to be interested in the story, and I had to tell the story. Yeah.
Where did your family come from? From the Midwest? You moved out?
My mother came from Canada, from England, and then Canada and down. My father's side they were Pennsylvania Dutch, basically, but German. They came and they lived in Pennsylvania before the before the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother's father came from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So
So they weren't really in the Midwest moving out?
no. Well, they did in stages. They did in stages, but they basically came out. My grandpa was born in Colorado in the Telluride area. One of the parts I put into the book is that the setting is real. Nissa, Oregon is where I was born. Adrian is where my grandparents homesteaded. Ontario is the largest city and right next to the border of Idaho. There's another little place where they live, it's called Cow Hollow, and it was the CCC camp, the Conservation Corps, the men who volunteered from age 18, I think, to 22, and were paid for their labors and went all over the Pacific Northwest. And the Farm Security Administration asked for Cow Hollow once World War II started so that they could put some of the Japanese there. And Japanese lived there until about 1962 or so. The older folks didn't have a place to go to. They couldn't work anymore. And they allowed them to stay at Cow Hollow until they essentially died off.
Wow.
Many of the Japanese Americans, before the war, there were about 135 Japanese who lived in the area. After the war, because they could buy the land, because there were people who were willing to employ them, there were about 1,600 Japanese Americans who lived there and went there to live. They have a Buddhist temple there. The Japanese gave up their community house, community club to Ontario as a gesture of goodwill. So a lot of people went there to live, especially because they were welcomed there, and they felt that they could be accepted for who they were.
Yeah. Some of the photos show how harsh, difficult that life was for the farmers, the European American farmers.
Yeah.
You show those photos of houses that were basically underground, and I had never realized that things were so difficult for them.
A lot of the farmers who came out during the Depression were excited about water. The Owyhee Dam was built, and there was a huge homesteading act that people could go and live. They had to prove up for 3 years. My grandpa had to do that because he was in World War I. He didn't have to prove up for longer than that. He only was for 3 years. And there were new irrigation ditches that were being built, but the soil was like flour, and it wouldn't hold the corrugations until they'd had a couple of years of alfalfa or something they could plow under. And so a lot of the farmers, the people that came there, were from Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, because their farms had blown away with the Dust Bowl.
Right.
And so a lot of people lived there for that reason. And they lived, it was hot. It's hot. It was a desert, and until they got the water there. And so my grandparents lived in a basement house. Ellis in the story lives in a basement house, and they dug it out. They had some windows on the top, but they did flat roof and nothing on the top. Eventually, when they had another good year of farming, they were going to build the main story. Well, they never did. They never did get that. So they built a roof, kind of an elongated roof, and my grandparents lived upstairs, and when I was a child, I lived downstairs in that house. And so, people didn't have it great, and they didn't have a phone for years. There was one in the neighborhood, and so that's, yeah.
We know stories about Japanese Americans who were sent to camps for the duration of the war. But there was also this aspect which you lift up of where a number of the Japanese were allowed to work in Eastern Oregon because they needed additional workers to harvest the crops. And so you focus on particularly George Yano and his family, and they opt to go to work in the fields rather than stay in the internment camps.
It was the only camp, labor camp, that President Roosevelt approved outside of the internment camps as we know them. It's only been documented fairly recently that this labor camp existed. And in fact, it was helped by Russell Lee, who was a farm security administrator photographer who took pictures of the Nissa camp. And we found those pictures as well when we were doing the research about the camp.
Okay.
The cover is taken by Russell Lee. So this is a historical picture. We colorized it and put color in it, but this is an actual picture of one of the Japanese that worked in the sugar beet fields, and this is a sugar beet field. So I tried to make it realistic cover-wise as well as realistic in the story. And anyone who likes historical fiction, who likes a love story, who likes conflict and resolution, resilience, I think they would like this book.
Yeah, I would agree. This sounds like it required a lot of research, because if you didn't know about the story of the Japanese Americans then, how did you learn how to portray their experience?
The first thing I did was in 1985, believe it or not, but my dad and my stepmom and I were in Eastern Oregon and doing, that was home for us, so we would frequently go to Eastern Oregon. And I looked up the newspaper articles at the Ontario Library that were taken, the articles that were written during World War II, so 1942 to 1945, and found a number of articles about the Japanese and what people felt about them, where they lived, a Japanese man that had been hit by a truck, all kinds of anger that they were going to be allowed to buy land. And so it was very interesting. So I did those clippings first, and then I gradually educated myself, did a lot of reading, and I took a class in Seattle from the Japanese American Citizenship League in how to teach about the Japanese internment. And I wasn't a teacher then, I was an assistant principal, but I felt like I was a student again, trying to learn some part of our history that I didn't know.
Right. For our viewers' benefit, the Japanese Americans of the first generation were not allowed to own land, but their children, the Nisei, the second generation, in time were allowed to purchase land.
Yes, because they were born in the United States,
Yeah.
they had the right to buy property.
Yeah.
And whether they liked it or not, they had that right. And
Yeah.
so Governor Sprague at the time, Oregon's governor, said over and over again that they have this right to buy land. Now, Governor Sprague was the only governor in the western states who wanted the Japanese. Everyone else said when they come, as soon as the war is over, they need to go back. We don't want them to stay. But Governor Sprague wanted them. He felt that they were very hard workers and would benefit Oregon. Just to talk a little bit about that, George Aiken was Governor Sprague's executive secretary, and he was from Ontario. And so Roosevelt came to see the dam in 1937 or 38 or whatever, and he couldn't go all the way up. It was up a dirt road. So, but the men wanted to develop the desert. They had to use the water that they had, the money that they had put into this. And so with the Homestead Act and then bringing the water on the pipes, and then the government ditches would flow, the farmers all had to dig their own ditches, and they had to do all of their own things. So it was a rough life.
Wow, yeah.
But because of the man from Ontario, and they knew that the Japanese were excellent farmers, they wanted to accept them over in Eastern Oregon, and it was the only camp that Roosevelt approved.
Interesting. I think it's a real strong point in your book how you portray both the anti-Japanese attitudes of the townsfolk, the farmers and such, but then you also lift up those individuals who treated the Japanese with dignity, with decency, with fairness, And that was very moving, that we could see the casual racism of the day, but then see those who stood up against that.
As a child, I only knew them as Japs. That was their name, and so it took me an understanding. My grandson, who's 12, is reading my book with his mother, and he said, "Mom, that's just like calling somebody the N-word, isn't it?" And he understands that, but I did not understand that, having grown up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long did it take to research and then write the book?
I didn't really start until I retired. I retired in 2011, and I wrote the first 18 pages, gave it to Ned Piper, and he told me it was boring. So that was the first draft. And then, how boring, how wonderful can it be to hoe beets? That's not really jazzy or exciting. So I didn't want to go into the war because I don't know anything about war. I've never been in the service or anything. And so I thought, well, I can do people. I can do their relationships. I can talk about who they are as people. And so that's what I focused on. I tried to find my characters. And I fell in love with the characters. And then I had to figure out how to do dialogue and how to do all these other things. I taught English, but I didn't know how to write a book.
Right.
I had to learn that.
Sure. You've based some of your books, some of the characters, on actual experiences that you uncovered, both in your family and among Japanese who had been in the camps and been in Eastern Oregon, right?
Yeah. The main person I talked to was Paul Hirai, and I dedicated this book to Paul Hirai and to my father, Dudley Kurtz. Paul Hirai was from the Hirai family that lived down at the corner from my grandparents' farm. And when I talked to him on the phone the first time, he asked me if I had lost a cousin or an aunt or an uncle to drowning. And I said, I lost my brother, my baby brother. And I was only 3 or 4 months old at the time. My brother had wandered across the road and fallen into the government ditch, hit his head, and went down the ditch and then down another portion of it. And Paul Hirai was the one who found him. And I did not know that. I got goosebumps at that point. And Paul would even call me if we had a windstorm or whatever and check to make sure I was okay. And he loved the love story between George and Molly. He thought that was the best part, he thought. Unfortunately, I didn't finish the book before he died. He died this last summer at 92. My dad is still alive. He'll turn 96 on Sunday. So yes, I told a lot of stories about hoeing, about the irrigation, about the, I asked the Japanese Americans that I know, about names, and they said, we have to put a character in there named George because everybody has a family member named George. So George is my main character. Mm-hmm. And I've been to several of the internment camps, not Minidoka where the story takes place, but I've been to Tule Lake, and I've been to the one in Wyoming, and Tule Lake. I used Tule Lake and Minidoka as two opposite camps. Tule Lake was a rebellious camp, and in fact it became a segregation camp where they put people who were loyal to the Japanese government or they felt were loyal to the Japanese government. And then Minidoka, where more people volunteered for the 442nd Combat Team than any other. So I compared and contrasted those two visions of what the Japanese felt during World War II. Tried to do that. Yeah,
certainly that was very moving. How some of the Japanese Americans felt deep loyalty to the United States in spite of their treatment. A number of them, or their sons, volunteered for the 442nd Battalion, which was highly decorated during World War II. And then you had others who were very angry, rightfully we might say, about their treatment as American citizens to be put into these camps. I liked that contrast that you shared. We should probably help the viewers understand the significance of your title, A Shrug of the Shoulders. Where did that come from?
There's an expression, and I don't speak Japanese, so my apologies to anyone who does, shikata ga nai, and it means, it's like a verbal shrug of the shoulders. And so it's supposed to mean that you have to accept the difficulties of life and move on. Now, it's not like que sera, sera, whatever will be in the French, because it's not to do with fate, but it's to do with the resilience that they had, that it was so hard. They would lose their farms, they would lose their business, they would lose a son in the war. And shikata ga nai meant you picked yourself up, you dealt with this most difficult thing, and you moved on.
Yeah. You bear the unbearable.
You bear the unbearable.
Very good. This is your first book. Were there any surprises in the writing of it? Anything that that was sort of, oh wow, experience for you?
I had to learn lots of things before I could come up with a good book. One of the surprises was that one of my first reviewers said that I didn't have a plot. And I was like, what do you mean? I have all these people and all their problems, and what do you mean I don't have a plot? So I had to figure out how to make the conflict resolve right at the end. And I have George losing the farm in the center of the book. Well, how can you continue a storyline if everything he's been working for is lost? It's the shikata ga nai. He has to get himself up again and start farming again, start understanding what he needed to do. He almost loses Molly as his wife, and he has to learn what he didn't know, why he almost lost her. So, and then Abe, who is the second brother, the Yano brother, all of a sudden he's in the war, something I did not want to do. And I had, at the very last draft of the book, I was researching the language schools and the fact that there were Japanese who helped the Marines and the Navy in the Pacific against the Japanese, who interrogated prisoners, who read documents, and that's what I have Abe do. And again, I wasn't wanting to be excellent in the war, but in communications between him, he interrogates prisoners, between him and the prisoners. So that's what I did.
You, whether it's in the Pacific or back home in Eastern Oregon, you tell the story of the war through the individuals, and I think it makes it so personal and so moving throughout. As a first-time novelist, what would you advise, or what would your advice be to first-time novelists?
Well, this was my goal. My goal was to get my novel published. I felt that if it wasn't good enough to be published, I didn't want to self-publish it. I wanted, if there were errors in the story, I wanted to be sure to fix them before I let the story out. I loved my story. And so what I would tell first-time novelists is listen to all the critics. I had to put it down for 2 years before I picked it up again and started writing again. Listen to your critics. It hurts to get some of the criticism, but they're usually right. And seek out people who can help you learn. Take classes, go to writers' conferences. I've had a couple of 3 different writing groups. And always be open to changing your story in order to make it better. So I have a whole bunch of cut files. I could write another novel with all the things I cut out.
Good. What are you working on now?
Well, my second novel is, I like historical fiction. So I started writing a story based on my mother's story. She was abandoned by her father. Her mother died when she was almost 5, and her father couldn't work and keep his daughters together, and he eventually abandoned them. She had there were 4 girls, and the 2 oldest ones went with the grandmother, and the 2 younger ones, mom was third, become essentially almost kidnapped away from the father. He didn't know what happened to them. And she found the family again when she was 21. So I think that's kind of like a wow story. And I wrote it. It wasn't long enough. So I'm rewriting it. This is essentially my 3rd draft.
Great. Well, we look forward to that as well. Well, congratulations on achieving one of your dreams. And I can highly recommend this book. I was very moved by it. I've read it in several drafts, and I would recommend it to our readers as well. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.